Welcome back to The Sleep Detective, where we explore the darkest corners of criminal psychology through AI-enhanced storytelling. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving into one of the most psychologically complex cases in criminal history. Edmund Kemper stands apart from other serial killers not just because of his massive 6'9" frame, but because of his genius-level IQ of 145. This is a man who could have been anything: a professor, a researcher, a leader. Instead, he became one of America's most articulate and terrifying killers. What psychological forces can turn exceptional intelligence into a weapon of destruction? Here's your challenge for tonight's deep dive. As we explore Kemper's psychology, I want you to predict what you think was the single most important psychological factor in his development. Was it his relationship with his mother, his early violent fantasies, his social isolation, or something else entirely? Drop your prediction in the comments below. If you're fascinated by the intersection of high intelligence and criminal behavior, hit that subscribe button now. We release these deep psychological analyses every 48 hours, and you won't want to miss our upcoming series on how genius-level killers think differently from other criminals. December 18, 1948, Santa Cruz, California. A baby is born who will challenge everything we think we know about intelligence and evil. Edmund Emil Kemper III enters the world with a brain destined for greatness. But greatness can take many forms. From his earliest moments, Ed displays signs of exceptional cognitive ability. By age 4, he's reading at a high school level. His memory is photographic. His analytical skills are off the charts. But intelligence without proper emotional development becomes a dangerous weapon. His parents, Edmund J.R.B. and Clarnell, represent a psychological powder keg. His father is emotionally distant, often absent due to work. His mother is controlling, critical, and emotionally abusive. For a highly intelligent child, this creates a perfect storm of psychological damage. The family dynamic sets the foundation for everything that follows. Clarnell constantly belittles young Ed, calling him stupid despite his obvious intelligence. She criticizes his appearance, his behavior, his very existence. For a gifted child, this creates deep psychological wounds that fester. Intelligence becomes both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. Ed begins to understand that he can outsmart the adults around him. He starts manipulating situations to his advantage. This isn't typical childhood mischief. This is calculated psychological manipulation. By age 6, Ed shows signs of what psychologists call emotional dysregulation. He cannot process feelings normally. When other children get angry, they might throw tantrums. When Ed gets angry, he begins planning elaborate revenge scenarios in his mind. His IQ tests consistently show scores above 140, placing him in the top 1% of the population. But emotional intelligence? That's severely underdeveloped. He can solve complex problems but cannot navigate basic human relationships. This disconnect becomes crucial to his psychological development. School becomes a battleground between his intellectual gifts and his emotional deficits. Teachers recognize his brilliance, but are disturbed by his inability to connect with other children. He's too smart for his peer group, but too emotionally immature for older students. The isolation begins early. While other children play games, Ed retreats into his mind. He creates elaborate fantasy worlds where he has complete control. These fantasies become increasingly dark as his emotional wounds deepen. Control becomes his primary psychological need. His mother's psychological abuse intensifies as he grows. She seems threatened by his intelligence, perhaps recognizing that he might one day be smart enough to see through her manipulation. This creates a psychological arms race between mother and son that will have devastating consequences. Ed learns to compartmentalize his emotions at an early age. Part of his mind stores away the pain and humiliation. Another part begins calculating how to gain power over others. This compartmentalization will become his most dangerous psychological tool. His father's absence creates a void that intelligent children often try to fill through understanding. Ed begins studying human behavior obsessively. He watches people. He analyzes their weaknesses. He learns what makes them tick. But he uses this knowledge for control, not connection. By age 8, Ed's psychological profile shows clear signs of what will later be diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. But unlike typical cases, his high intelligence allows him to mask these tendencies behind a facade of normalcy. The psychological foundation is now set. Exceptional intelligence combined with severe emotional trauma and a deep need for control. Add to this a mother who seems to enjoy psychologically torturing her gifted son, and you have all the elements needed to create a monster. His early fascination with death begins during this period. While other children might be curious about death in normal ways, Ed's interest is methodical and intense. He starts killing small animals, not out of sadism, but as psychological experiments to understand power and control. The pattern is established: intelligence without empathy, brilliance without emotional connection. A mind capable of incredible analysis turned toward understanding how to dominate and destroy. The psychological foundation for one of America's most articulate killers is complete. What happens when a genius-level mind develops without proper emotional nurturing? When exceptional intelligence is paired with severe psychological damage? When a brilliant child learns that people are puzzles to be solved rather than beings to connect with? His childhood friends later describe him as different but struggle to articulate exactly how. He could solve any problem, answer any question, outsmart any adult. But there was something cold behind his eyes, something calculating, something that made them unconsciously step back. The psychological ingredients are now mixed. The foundation is laid. In our next segment, we'll explore how these early psychological patterns began forming into the personality that would terrorize California. We'll see how exceptional intelligence, when paired with emotional damage, can create something far more dangerous than typical criminal behavior. The genius giant is taking shape, and his psychological development is just beginning to reveal its true terrifying potential. The question isn't whether this psychological foundation will lead to violence. The question is how much devastation one brilliant, damaged mind can create. Ed Kemper, at age 10, already possesses the psychological tools that will make him one of the most dangerous killers in American history. The foundation is complete. Now comes the construction of a monster whose intelligence will make him nearly impossible to catch. The psychological die is cast. The patterns are set. The genius giant's journey into darkness has begun, and his exceptional mind will make that journey far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. But this is just the beginning. The psychological foundation we've explored tonight will support a structure of violence and manipulation that will challenge everything law enforcement thinks they know about criminal behavior. Next time, we'll watch as this psychological foundation begins supporting the formation of one of the most complex and dangerous personalities in criminal psychology. The genius giant is about to learn just how powerful his mind can be, and that discovery will change everything. Chat controls Sonnet 4. Age 11. Ed Kemper's psychological foundation is complete, but now comes the construction phase. The brilliant, damaged child begins forming the personality traits that will define him for life. This is where exceptional intelligence meets severe emotional dysfunction. His parents' divorce when he's 9 creates a new psychological dynamic. Clarnell gains full custody, and Ed's relationship with his mother becomes the central defining force of his personality development. She is both his greatest source of pain and his primary psychological obsession. The move to Helena, Montana with his mother represents a complete disruption of any stability Ed might have developed. New environment, new school, same psychological torture at home. His mother's criticism intensifies as he grows taller and more physically imposing. Ed's physical development accelerates dramatically during this period. By age 13, he's already over 6 feet tall, but psychological development lags far behind physical growth. He has the body of a young man but the emotional regulation skills of a much younger child. His intelligence becomes his primary coping mechanism. While other teenagers struggle with identity formation, Ed uses his analytical skills to study human behavior like a scientist. He begins categorizing people's weaknesses, mapping their psychological vulnerabilities. The personality trait that emerges most strongly is what psychologists call grandiose narcissism. Ed begins to see himself as intellectually superior to everyone around him. This isn't typical teenage arrogance. This is calculated psychological superiority based on genuine intellectual gifts. His relationship with authority figures becomes increasingly complex. Teachers recognize his brilliance, but are disturbed by his inability to show genuine respect or empathy. He can mimic appropriate responses, but there's something hollow behind his interactions. Ed develops what will become his signature psychological trait, the ability to present a charming, articulate facade while maintaining complete emotional detachment. He learns to say what people want to hear while feeling nothing genuine toward them. His mother's psychological abuse takes on new dimensions as he grows. She begins expressing fear of his physical size while simultaneously emasculating him psychologically. This creates a dangerous internal conflict between power and vulnerability that shapes his core personality. The fantasy life that began in early childhood now becomes increasingly sophisticated and violent. Ed doesn't just imagine harming others. He plans elaborate scenarios with the precision of a military strategist. His intelligence makes these fantasies disturbingly detailed and methodical. Social isolation intensifies during these crucial personality-forming years. Ed's intellectual gifts set him apart from peers, but his emotional dysfunction prevents genuine connections. He begins to see other people as objects to be studied rather than individuals to befriend. His relationship with his maternal grandparents becomes psychologically significant. They represent stability and kindness that's absent from his relationship with his mother. But even this positive influence cannot counteract the deep psychological damage already established. Ed begins experimenting with manipulation during this period. He learns to use his intelligence and growing physical presence to get what he wants from others. These aren't childish manipulations. They're calculated psychological experiments in human control. The personality disorder symptoms become more pronounced. Lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self, manipulation of others, shallow emotional responses. But unlike typical cases, Ed's high intelligence allows him to mask these traits behind a facade of normalcy and charm. His academic performance remains exceptional despite his psychological dysfunction. Teachers are puzzled by a student who can excel intellectually while showing such disturbed interpersonal patterns. This contradiction becomes a defining feature of his personality. Ed develops an intense fascination with psychology and psychiatry during this period. He begins reading advanced texts on human behavior, not to understand himself, but to better understand how to control others. Knowledge becomes a weapon in his psychological arsenal. The anger that's been building since early childhood begins taking on more sophisticated forms. Instead of outbursts, Ed learns to channel rage into cold, calculated planning. This emotional regulation actually makes him more dangerous, not less. His relationship with his younger sisters becomes psychologically revealing. He shows no genuine protective instincts despite being the older brother. Instead, he studies them like psychological test subjects, learning how fear and vulnerability operate in people he should love. Ed's personality formation during these crucial teenage years establishes patterns that will persist throughout his life. Intellectual superiority combined with emotional emptiness. Charm paired with complete lack of genuine empathy. Analytical brilliance focused on understanding human weakness. The psychological profile emerging during this period shows classic psychopathic traits enhanced by exceptional intelligence. Ed doesn't just lack empathy. He uses his understanding of empathy as a tool to manipulate others more effectively. His mother continues to be both his greatest psychological tormentor and his primary obsession. Their relationship becomes increasingly toxic as Ed grows physically larger, but remains emotionally dependent on her approval and devastated by her rejection. By age 14, Ed has developed the core personality traits that will define his adult criminal behavior. Grandiose narcissism, emotional detachment, manipulative charm, and a cold, analytical approach to human relationships. His intelligence makes each of these traits more sophisticated and dangerous. The personality formation phase reveals a disturbing truth about criminal psychology. When exceptional intelligence develops alongside severe personality disorders, the result isn't just another troubled teenager. It's the creation of someone who can understand human psychology well enough to exploit it systematically. Ed's teenage years show how personality disorders can be enhanced rather than hindered by high intelligence. His analytical skills don't help him develop better relationships. They help him become a more effective predator. The charming, articulate facade that will later fool psychiatrists, police officers, and even FBI profilers is fully formed. By his mid-teens, Ed has learned to present himself as intelligent, thoughtful, and even vulnerable while maintaining complete emotional detachment. His personality development during this crucial period establishes the psychological framework for everything that follows. The brilliant child with severe emotional damage has become a teenager with sophisticated antisocial personality traits masked by exceptional intellectual gifts. The foundation was psychological damage. The structure being built on that foundation is a personality designed for manipulation, control, and ultimately predation. Ed Kemper's personality formation reveals how intelligence can serve darkness as effectively as it serves light. By age 15, the core personality is complete. Intellectual brilliance combined with emotional emptiness. Analytical precision focused on human vulnerability. Charming presentation masking complete psychological detachment. The genius giant's personality is formed. What happens when this personality begins interacting with the world? When these traits start being tested in real relationships and real situations? When the theoretical becomes practical? Our next segment will explore how these personality traits began manifesting as actual behavioral patterns. The personality is formed. Now comes the testing phase, and the results will be more disturbing than anyone could predict. The genius giant is about to discover just how powerful his psychological weapons can be. Chat controls Sonnet 4. Age 13. The personality is formed, but now something darker begins stirring in Ed Kemper's brilliant mind. The first genuine violent impulses emerge, and his exceptional intelligence makes them far more sophisticated and dangerous than typical adolescent aggression. It starts with animals, not the random cruelty some troubled children display, but methodical, calculated experimentation. Ed approaches animal killing like a scientific study. He wants to understand power, control, and the precise mechanics of death. His first victim is the family cat, but this isn't an impulsive act of anger. Ed plans it carefully, studying the animal's behavior patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity. When he acts, it's with the precision of a researcher conducting an experiment. The psychological satisfaction Ed derives from this act is different from typical animal cruelty. He doesn't enjoy the suffering itself. He enjoys the absolute control, the power to decide life and death, the intellectual challenge of executing his plan perfectly. His mother's discovery of the dead cat leads to one of their most psychologically significant confrontations. Instead of showing remorse, Ed displays what psychologists call intellectual justification. He can explain his actions logically, but shows no emotional understanding of their wrongness. The killing escalates systematically. More cats, then larger animals. Each death becomes a learning experience, a psychological experiment in power and control. Ed approaches violence the way other gifted teenagers might approach advanced mathematics or science projects. His analytical mind begins categorizing different methods of killing. He studies which approaches provide the most control, which create the most fear, which give him the greatest sense of psychological satisfaction. This isn't random violence, it's systematic research. The psychological pattern emerging during this period is deeply disturbing. Ed doesn't kill because he's angry or out of control. He kills because the act of killing provides intellectual stimulation and psychological satisfaction that nothing else can match. His fantasies become increasingly sophisticated during this period. While other teenagers might fantasize about sports or romance, Ed creates elaborate scenarios involving capture, control, and murder. His intelligence makes these fantasies disturbingly detailed and methodical. The first human-focused impulses begin around age 14. Ed starts studying people the same way he studied animals before killing them. He analyzes their vulnerabilities, their fears, their psychological weak points. But he hasn't yet made the leap to human victims. His relationship with his mother during this period becomes psychologically crucial. The animal killings seem to be practiced for something larger, and Clarnell represents the ultimate target of his rage and need for control. But he's not ready yet. The impulses are building. Ed begins experimenting with psychological intimidation during this period. He uses his size and intelligence to frighten classmates and family members. These aren't random acts of bullying. They're calculated experiments in psychological control and fear manipulation. The violent fantasies become more frequent and more detailed. Ed spends hours mentally rehearsing elaborate scenarios involving capture, torture, and murder. His analytical mind treats these fantasies like complex problems to be solved rather than disturbing thoughts to be suppressed. His intellectual curiosity about death and violence becomes academic in nature. Ed begins reading everything he can find about murder, violence, and criminal psychology. But he's not reading to understand himself. He's reading to improve his technique. The first impulse to kill a human being occurs when Ed is 14 years old. The target is a young girl he sees regularly in his neighborhood. He studies her patterns, plans an approach, even selects a location. But something stops him. The impulse isn't quite strong enough yet. This near action represents a crucial psychological threshold. Ed has crossed from fantasy into planning. The intellectual exercise has become operational planning. The psychological progression from damaged child to potential killer is nearly complete. His mother's increasing fear of his physical presence seems to trigger stronger violent impulses. Ed recognizes that Clarnell is genuinely frightened of what he might become, and this fear becomes psychologically intoxicating. Her terror feeds his growing sense of power. The animal killings become more frequent and more elaborate. Ed develops what he considers improved techniques for killing efficiently and quietly. Each death teaches him something new about the mechanics of violence and the psychology of control. His school performance during this period reveals a disturbing contradiction. Ed excels academically while showing increasingly antisocial behavior. Teachers are puzzled by a student who can analyze literature brilliantly while displaying such cold detachment from human emotion. The violent impulses begin targeting specific types of people. Young women who remind him of his mother. Authority figures who try to control him. Anyone who triggers his deep-seated need to demonstrate psychological dominance. The target selection process becomes increasingly systematic. Ed's first serious consideration of matricide occurs during this period. The impulse to kill his mother isn't driven by momentary anger but by calculated analysis of their psychological dynamic. He begins to see her murder as the ultimate solution to his psychological conflict. The dark impulses are no longer occasional intrusions. They become a constant background presence in Ed's mental life. He spends increasing amounts of time planning, fantasizing, and preparing for violence that he knows will eventually become reality. His psychological development during this period shows how exceptional intelligence can enhance rather than diminish violent impulses. Ed doesn't struggle with moral confusion. He understands exactly what he's thinking about doing and why. That clarity makes him more dangerous, not less. The animal killings serve as both psychological release and practical training. Each death satisfies his need for control while teaching him valuable lessons about the mechanics of murder. His analytical mind treats violence as a skill to be perfected. By age 15, the dark impulses have become Ed's primary psychological preoccupation. Planning violence gives him more intellectual satisfaction than any academic achievement. The brilliant mind that could have solved complex scientific problems is instead focused on perfecting murder techniques. The progression from damaged child to violent fantasist to methodical planner is nearly complete. Ed's exceptional intelligence has transformed typical adolescent aggression into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The dark impulses are no longer impulses. They're becoming plans. His psychological state during this period represents one of the most dangerous combinations in criminal psychology. Exceptional intelligence paired with complete emotional detachment. Sophisticated planning ability focused on violence and control. Analytical precision applied to the study of human vulnerability. The first dark impulses have evolved into systematic preparation for murder. Ed Kemper at 15 possesses both the intellectual capacity and the psychological motivation to become one of America's most dangerous killers. The only question remaining is when these impulses will finally translate into action. The psychological foundation was damage. The personality formation was disorder. The first dark impulses represent the moment when exceptional intelligence fully aligned itself with violent intent. The genius giant is almost ready to kill. What happens when these carefully cultivated impulses finally demand expression? When the planning phase ends and the action phase begins? When the brilliant analytical mind decides it's time to test its theories in practice? Our next segment will explore the environmental factors that finally triggered the transition from impulse to action. Chat controls Sonnet 4. Age 15. Ed Kemper's dark impulses are fully formed, but they need environmental catalysts to transform from fantasy into reality. The psychological powder keg is complete. Now comes the spark that will ignite everything. The primary trigger arrives in the form of a custody decision. Clarnell, increasingly fearful of her son's size and strange behavior, makes a choice that will have devastating consequences. She sends Ed to live with his paternal grandparents in North Fork, California. This decision represents the ultimate psychological rejection in Ed's mind. The mother who has tormented him for years is now literally casting him out. For someone with his psychological profile, this abandonment triggers a rage that has been building for over a decade. The move to his grandparents' ranch in 1960 places Ed in an isolated rural environment with two elderly people who have no understanding of his psychological complexity. Edmund and Maud Kemper are kind, simple people unprepared for the psychological storm they're about to encounter. Ed's grandfather, Edmund Kemper, represents everything Ed has been taught to resent about male authority figures. The old man is traditional, demanding, and completely unaware that he's living with someone whose intellectual capacity far exceeds his own while lacking any emotional regulation. The rural isolation becomes psychologically significant. Ed is cut off from the social structures that provided some minimal behavioral control. No teachers observing him. No classmates to impress with his facade of normalcy. Just an elderly couple and vast empty spaces where anything could happen. His grandmother Maud becomes the focus of increasingly intense psychological projections. She's female, authority figure, and completely vulnerable. In Ed's disturbed psychology, she represents both his mother and the perfect victim for testing his violent theories. The weapons available on the ranch provide the practical means for violence. Rifles for hunting are easily accessible. Ed begins studying these weapons with the same analytical intensity he once applied to animal killing. The tools of violence are now within reach. Ed's academic isolation during this period removes another behavioral control mechanism. Without the intellectual stimulation of advanced coursework, his brilliant mind focuses entirely on violent fantasies and practical planning. Boredom becomes a dangerous psychological trigger. The generational conflict with his grandparents intensifies daily. They see a troubled teenager who needs discipline and structure. Ed sees two obstacles to his psychological freedom who are weak enough to be eliminated. The perception gap becomes increasingly dangerous. His grandfather's attempts to impose traditional masculine discipline trigger Ed's deep-seated rage against male authority figures. Every correction, every attempt at guidance, feeds the psychological fury that has been building since early childhood. The isolation allows Ed's violent fantasies to become increasingly elaborate and realistic. Without external distractions, he spends hours each day mentally rehearsing murder scenarios. The distinction between fantasy and planning begins to disappear completely. Ed's relationship with his grandmother reveals the full extent of his psychological dysfunction. He can engage in normal conversation while simultaneously planning her murder. The compartmentalization that began in childhood is now complete and terrifying. The triggering event occurs on August 27, 1964. Ed's grandmother criticizes his reading material violent crime magazines that feed his fantasies. This seemingly minor correction becomes the catalyst that transforms 15 years of psychological damage into violent action. The psychological state Ed enters during the killing represents a complete break from normal human emotion. He shoots his grandmother in the head while she sits at the kitchen table. But instead of panic or remorse, he feels curiosity about what he's just accomplished. The second murder follows quickly. When his grandfather returns from errands, Ed shoots him too. Not because the old man poses a threat, but because Ed wants to spare him the trauma of discovering his wife's body. This rationalization reveals his complete emotional detachment. The environmental factors that enabled this violence are crucial to understanding criminal psychology. Isolation removes social controls. Access to weapons provided means. Psychological triggers activated long-suppressed rage. The combination proved lethal. Ed's behavior immediately after the killings shows how his analytical mind processes extreme violence. He calls his mother to confess, not because he feels guilty, but because he's curious about her reaction. The murders become psychological experiments. The rural setting provides Ed with time to process what he's done before authorities arrive. Instead of panic, he experiences what he later describes as intellectual satisfaction. He has finally tested his violent theories in practice and found them effective. The environmental isolation that enabled the violence also provides Ed with space to analyze his psychological state after killing. He discovers that murder provides the ultimate sense of control and power he's been seeking. The psychological reward system is now established. His grandparents' trusting nature made them perfect victims for someone with Ed's psychological profile. They never suspected that the intelligent teenager in their home was planning their deaths. Their kindness became a vulnerability he exploited. The availability of firearms on the ranch represents a crucial environmental factor. Ed's violent impulses might have remained fantasies without easy access to efficient killing tools. The weapons transformed psychological potential into deadly reality. Ed's confession to police reveals how environmental factors combined with his psychological makeup to create a perfect storm of violence. He can explain his actions logically while showing no emotional understanding of their impact. The psychological analysis of these environmental triggers reveals how situational factors can activate dormant violent potential. Ed's psychological foundation was already established. The environment simply provided the catalyst for action. The isolation from his mother during this period creates a psychological pressure cooker effect. Instead of the constant conflict with Clarnell providing an outlet for his rage, the separation allows that fury to build to explosive levels. His grandparents' inability to recognize the signs of his psychological disturbance represents a tragic environmental failure. With proper assessment and intervention, this violence might have been prevented. Instead, kind but naive people became victims. The rural ranch environment provides Ed with the perfect testing ground for violence. No immediate neighbors to hear gunshots. No witnesses to observe suspicious behavior. No social oversight to prevent escalation from fantasy to action. Ed's psychological state after the killings shows how environmental factors can normalize violence for someone with his profile. The isolated ranch setting makes murder seem almost routine, like any other farm chore to be completed efficiently. The environmental triggers that enabled Ed's first murders establish a pattern that will persist throughout his criminal career. Isolation plus opportunity plus psychological stress equals violence. The formula is now proven and will be repeated. By age 15, Ed Kemper has discovered that his violent fantasies can become reality when environmental conditions align properly. The psychological foundation, personality formation, and dark impulses have finally found their environmental catalyst. The transformation from fantasy to action is complete. The environmental triggers have activated a killing machine that will prove nearly impossible to stop. The genius giant has tasted blood. and the psychological reward has exceeded even his analytical expectations. What happens when someone with Ed's psychological profile discovers that murder provides ultimate satisfaction? When environmental factors prove that violence is both possible and rewarding? When the brilliant analytical mind decides that killing is the perfect solution to psychological problems? Chat controls Sonnet 4. December 1964. Ed Kemper enters Atascadero State Hospital as a 15-year-old double murderer. What emerges 5 years later is something far more dangerous. A sophisticated predator who has transformed a psychiatric institution into his personal academy for perfecting violence. The naive teenager becomes a methodical killer. The irony of Ed's institutional placement cannot be overstated. California's most advanced psychiatric facility, designed to rehabilitate violent criminals, instead provides the perfect laboratory for someone with Ed's intellectual gifts to systematically study and refine criminal methodology. He doesn't get better, he gets smarter. Ed's intake evaluation reveals the psychological complexity that will make him so dangerous. His genius-level IQ combined with complete emotional detachment creates a patient unlike anything the staff has encountered. They see a troubled teenager who needs help. He sees research subjects to study and manipulate. The initial months at Atascadero establish Ed's approach to institutional manipulation. Rather than resisting treatment, he embraces it enthusiastically. Every therapy session becomes a masterclass in understanding how mental health professionals think and what they want to hear from patients. Ed's psychological education begins immediately through access to the hospital's extensive library. Criminal psychology texts, psychiatric journals, case studies of violent behavior. Most patients avoid this material. Ed devours it, treating each text as instruction manual for perfecting his criminal methodology. The group therapy dynamics provide Ed with live subjects for psychological experimentation. He learns to identify genuine remorse versus performed rehabilitation in other patients. More importantly, he discovers how to mirror the emotional responses that indicate successful treatment to authority figures. Ed's relationship with hospital staff becomes a calculated exercise in charm and manipulation. He identifies each person's psychological vulnerabilities, their professional insecurities, their emotional needs. Then he provides exactly what they require to see him as cooperative and improving. The diagnostic process teaches Ed invaluable lessons about psychological evaluation. He learns which test responses indicate antisocial tendencies, which behavioral patterns suggest successful rehabilitation, which emotional displays convince professionals of genuine change. The assessments become games he masters completely. Ed's systematic study of fellow inmates provides advanced education in criminal methodology. Conversations with other violent offenders teach him techniques he never considered. Armed robbers explain surveillance detection. Sex offenders discuss victim selection psychology. Each criminal becomes an unwitting instructor. The hospital's security procedures give Ed comprehensive understanding of institutional vulnerability assessment. He studies guard schedules, identifies surveillance blind spots, maps facility weak points. This security analysis enhances his strategic thinking for future criminal enterprises. Ed's participation in recreational activities becomes opportunities for psychological manipulation practice. Sports, games, and social interactions allow him to test different personas and manipulation techniques. He learns which approaches work with which personality types through systematic experimentation. The medical evaluation procedures that Ed undergoes monthly provide insight into professional decision-making processes. He discovers how psychiatric professionals weigh different factors when assessing patient progress, which indicators carry the most significance in release determinations. Ed's work assignments throughout the facility give him comprehensive understanding of institutional operations. Kitchen duty teaches him about routine disruption potential. Maintenance work reveals facility infrastructure vulnerabilities. Administrative assistance provides access to confidential patient information and staff evaluation procedures. The visitor interaction protocols become rehearsal opportunities for Ed's eventual reintegration into society. Family visits allow him to practice his reformed persona under observation, fine-tuning his performance based on staff reactions and family responses. Ed's legal consultation meetings provide education in criminal justice system navigation. Conversations with attorneys teach him about evidence requirements, investigative procedures, legal precedents. This knowledge will later help him avoid detection during his criminal career. The psychological counseling sessions evolve into sophisticated manipulation exercises. Ed learns to present surface-level insights about his mental state while concealing deeper psychological realities. He masters the art of appearing introspective without revealing genuine self-awareness. Ed's methodology for post-release behavior develops through careful observation of successful versus unsuccessful patient reintegration. He studies which release patients return to criminal behavior, which factors contribute to recidivism, which rehabilitation indicators predict genuine versus superficial change. The peer counseling programs that Ed participates in provide advanced training in psychological manipulation. Helping other patients with their problems teaches him to identify emotional vulnerabilities quickly and exploit them effectively. Therapy becomes predator training. Ed's analysis of institutional power structures reveals how bureaucratic systems function and can be manipulated. He learns which staff members have real authority, which administrative procedures carry weight, which documentation influences important decisions about patient status. The research projects that Ed volunteers for provide him with academic credibility while giving him access to professional psychological literature. His participation in studies on violent behavior ironically enhances his understanding of his own criminal psychology. Ed's preparation for release hearings becomes exercise in systematic deception. He practices appropriate emotional responses, rehearses convincing personal narratives, develops persuasive arguments for his rehabilitation. The performance becomes flawless through repetition and refinement. The psychological testing batteries that Ed completes throughout his institutionalization teach him how to manipulate assessment results. He learns which responses indicate successful treatment, which behavioral patterns suggest reduced risk, which personality presentations convince evaluators of genuine change. Ed's mentorship relationships with staff members provide him with professional psychological training. Doctors and therapists unknowingly teach him advanced techniques for understanding human behavior, reading emotional states, identifying psychological vulnerabilities. The education surpasses most graduate programs. The institutional routine that Ed masters during these years provides him with discipline and organizational skills that will enhance his future criminal efficiency. He learns to maintain long-term deception, execute complex plans, manage multiple personas simultaneously. By 1969, Ed's transformation is complete, but not in the way his doctors intended. 5 years of intensive psychological education has created not a rehabilitated patient but a sophisticated predator with systematic methodology for efficient violence. The institution graduates its most dangerous student. Ed's release evaluation represents the ultimate success of his institutional manipulation campaign. Psychiatric professionals describe him as insightful, cooperative, and fundamentally changed. They recommend his release based on their assessment of his rehabilitation. They have been thoroughly deceived by someone whose intelligence far exceeds their own. The methodology development phase concludes with Ed possessing unprecedented combination of criminal knowledge and legitimate psychological education. He understands both how to commit violence efficiently and how to evade detection by manipulating the very professionals trained to identify dangerous individuals. Ed Kemper leaves Atascadero State Hospital in December 1969 as perhaps the most methodologically sophisticated killer in American criminal history. 5 years of institutional education has transformed raw violent impulses into systematic predatory methodology. The genius giant is ready to hunt. What happens when this level of criminal sophistication meets the unsuspecting public? When institutional manipulation skills are applied to victim selection and police evasion. When the most dangerous graduate of America's psychiatric system begins implementing his methodological education. Spring 1970. Ed Kemper returns to Santa Cruz with his mother, armed with 5 years of institutional psychological education and a burning need to test his theories on human subjects. The methodological development is complete. Now begins the most chilling phase. The systematic psychological hunting of perfect victims. Living with Clarnell again creates an immediate psychological pressure cooker. Every interaction with his mother reactivates the deep rage that drove him to kill his grandparents. But Ed has learned patience during his institutional years. Clarnell will wait. He needs practice subjects first. The University of California, Santa Cruz campus spreads before Ed like a psychological buffet. Thousands of young women displaying every personality type, every vulnerability, every psychological pattern that might satisfy his need for control. His institutional education taught him to see people as case studies. Now he begins field research. Ed's car becomes his mobile laboratory for victim observation. He doesn't cruise randomly looking for targets. Instead, he establishes systematic patrol routes around campus, studying behavioral patterns, identifying psychological types, categorizing potential subjects by their vulnerability signatures. The hitchhiking culture of 1972nd California provides Ed with perfect access to isolated subjects, but his selection process reveals sophisticated psychological profiling. He doesn't stop for every hitchhiker. He studies them first, analyzing their body language, confidence levels, trust patterns before deciding whether they meet his research criteria. Ed's victim selection methodology begins with psychological accessibility assessment. He targets women who display openness to strangers, who lack defensive instincts, who seem psychologically hungry for connection and acceptance. Their emotional neediness becomes their fatal vulnerability. The campus social dynamics provide Ed with rich psychological data about his potential subjects. He observes students in cafeterias, libraries, dormitories. He learns to identify the lonely ones, the insecure ones, the ones desperate to prove their independence by taking risks like hitchhiking. Ed's analytical approach to victim psychology focuses on women who trigger specific emotional responses in him, not physical attraction, but psychological resonance. Women who remind him of his mother's confidence, her intellectual arrogance, her sense of superiority. Each potential victim represents a different aspect of his maternal rage. The selection timeline that Ed develops involves extended surveillance periods before any approach. He might study a potential victim for weeks, learning her class schedule, her social patterns, her psychological vulnerabilities. By the time he offers her a ride, He knows more about her than her closest friends do. Ed's understanding of female social conditioning becomes a weapon in his victim selection arsenal. He targets women taught to be polite, accommodating, and trusting. Their social programming to avoid appearing rude or paranoid creates openings he can exploit systematically. The psychological profiling that Ed conducts rivals professional law enforcement techniques. He categorizes potential victims by personality type: the overconfident student who thinks she's too smart to be victimized, the naive freshman seeking adventure, the rebellious daughter rejecting parental warnings about danger. Ed's victim age preferences reveal the deep psychological connections to his maternal trauma. He focuses on women in their late teens and early 20s, the age when his mother's psychological abuse was most devastating. Each victim represents Clarnell at the moment she inflicted maximum damage on his developing psyche. The geographical psychology of Ed's hunting patterns centers on locations where women feel safest but are actually most vulnerable. Campus pickup areas, familiar neighborhoods, trusted transportation routes. He understands that perceived safety creates psychological openness to approach. Ed's selection criteria include psychological isolation factors that mirror his own childhood experiences. He seeks women who appear lonely, disconnected from strong support systems, emotionally hungry for acceptance and validation. Their psychological neediness becomes his entry point. The victim personality analysis that Ed develops focuses on women who can satisfy his specific psychological requirements. He needs subjects who can be dominated completely, who represent maternal authority figures, who will provide maximum psychological satisfaction when controlled and ultimately destroyed. Ed's approach methodology adapts to each victim's psychological profile. For nervous hitchhikers, he presents himself as gentle and protective. For confident students, he displays intelligence and charm. The psychological mask reshapes itself to match each target's specific vulnerabilities and needs. The timing analysis that Ed employs focuses on moments of maximum psychological vulnerability. Students stressed about exams, women walking alone after arguments with boyfriends, hitchhikers desperate for transportation during bad weather. He identifies pressure points that compromise normal judgment and caution. Ed's understanding of victim psychology extends to post-selection behavior management. He learns which personality types will fight, which will freeze, which will attempt negotiation or escape. This knowledge allows him to control interactions with scientific precision from initial contact through final disposal. The psychological manipulation techniques that Ed develops for victim approach focus on creating scenarios where women feel they are choosing to trust him rather than being coerced. He positions himself and his vehicle to appear as rescue options for stranded hitchhikers. The victims select themselves. Ed's analysis of victims' social connections helps him choose targets whose disappearances will be attributed to lifestyle choices rather than systematic predation. Women who hitchhike regularly, who don't maintain close family contact, who make impulsive travel decisions. Their independence becomes their vulnerability. The psychological categorization system that Ed creates includes detailed analysis of how different personality types respond to his physical presence. His imposing size intimidates some women while reassuring others who associate large men with protection. He learns to use both reactions strategically. Ed's victim selection process accounts for investigative psychology considerations. He chooses women whose murders will be attributed to hitchhiking dangers or campus crime rather than sophisticated predation. Their lifestyle choices provide perfect cover for his systematic hunting activities. The behavioral analysis that Ed conducts includes studying how different women interact with authority figures. He selects victims who are unlikely to report suspicious encounters to police, who distrust law enforcement, or who lack confidence in their own danger instincts. Ed's psychological methodology for victim disposal selection focuses on women who can disappear without immediate investigation. Students between semesters, hitchhikers traveling without specific destinations, women who frequently change plans without notifying others. The disappearances blend into background noise. The campus culture assessment that Ed performs reveals which social groups produce the most vulnerable potential victims. Women rebelling against protective families, students seeking to prove their maturity through risk-taking, young women desperate to appear sophisticated and worldly. Ed's victim psychology research extends to understanding how different personalities respond to isolation and fear. This knowledge helps him plan the psychological components of his attacks, maximizing his sense of control while minimizing victim resistance or escape attempts. The selection refinement that Ed develops over months of observation focuses on identifying women who will provide optimal psychological satisfaction, not just victims who are easy to acquire, but subjects who will fulfill his specific emotional needs for dominance, control, and symbolic revenge against maternal authority. Ed's systematic approach to victim psychology transforms hunting from random violence into scientific predation. Each selection represents careful analysis of human vulnerability followed by precise exploitation of psychological weaknesses. The institutional education has created a perfect psychological predator. By 1972, Ed's victim psychology and selection methodology represents the evolution of predatory behavior enhanced by exceptional intelligence and systematic criminal education. He has become a perfect hunter capable of identifying and acquiring human targets with scientific precision and psychological sophistication. The victim selection process reveals the true horror of Ed's transformation. He has developed systematic approaches to identifying, analyzing, and acquiring human subjects based on academic understanding of psychology combined with 5 years of practical manipulation training. What happens when this sophisticated victim selection methodology combines with the killing techniques Ed perfected during institutionalization? When psychological profiling meets methodical murder? When the perfect predator begins implementing his systematic approach to human hunting? May 1972 to April 1973, Ed Kemper enters the most psychologically dangerous phase of his development. All the elements converge: institutional methodology, victim selection, expertise, and an escalating need for psychological satisfaction through violence. This is when the genius giant reaches his peak killing efficiency. The murder of Marion Pess and Anita Lucasa on May 7, 1972, represents Ed's psychological graduation from theory to practice. 5 years of institutional preparation, 2 years of victim observation, and a lifetime of psychological damage culminate in a killing spree that will demonstrate his true capabilities. Ed's psychological state during this period reflects complete integration of his various personalities. The charming social mask, the analytical criminal mind, and the violent predator operate as a unified system. There's no internal conflict, no moral struggle, only cold, calculated efficiency in pursuit of psychological satisfaction. The escalation pattern that Ed exhibits during his peak period reveals sophisticated psychological self-management. He doesn't kill impulsively or frequently enough to attract immediate attention. Instead, he spaces his murders strategically, allowing time for police attention to diminish while maintaining optimal psychological stimulation. Ed's mental state during actual killings shows how his institutional education translated into practical application. He maintains emotional detachment while committing extreme violence, treating each murder as a psychological experiment with specific research objectives. The victims become laboratory specimens. The psychological reward system that Ed has developed reaches peak efficiency during this period. Each successful murder provides intellectual satisfaction, emotional release, and practical validation of his methodological theories. The killing becomes psychologically addictive in ways that exceed typical criminal behavior. Ed's relationship with his mother during this peak period creates a psychological pressure that feeds his killing compulsion. Every interaction with Clarnell reinforces his need to demonstrate power over women who represent her psychological dominance. The murders become practice for the ultimate confrontation. The compartmentalization abilities that Ed displays during his peak killing period are psychologically extraordinary. He can commit brutal murders in the evening and attend family gatherings the next day, showing no behavioral indicators of his violent activities. The psychological separation is complete. Ed's peak psychological state includes sophisticated risk assessment capabilities that allow him to continue killing without detection. He analyzes police investigation patterns, media coverage, and public awareness levels. When attention increases, he pauses his activities until conditions improve. The psychological sophistication of Ed's victim interaction during this period reveals the full extent of his predatory evolution. He can engage in normal conversation while planning murder, provide emotional comfort while preparing to kill, maintain perfect behavioral control throughout extended victim contact. Ed's mental processing during violence demonstrates how exceptional intelligence can enhance rather than diminish brutal behavior. He approaches each murder with scientific curiosity, analyzing victim psychology, testing different techniques, studying the mechanics of death with analytical detachment. The psychological satisfaction that Ed derives from his peak killing period exceeds anything he experienced during his institutional years. The combination of absolute control, intellectual stimulation, and symbolic revenge against maternal authority creates psychological rewards that nothing else can match. Ed's peak psychological state includes increasingly sophisticated deception abilities that fool everyone around him. Family members, coworkers, mental health professionals, and law enforcement officers all perceive him as harmless, helpful, and psychologically stable. The performance reaches perfect calibration. The escalation psychology that Ed exhibits during this period shows how successful violence reinforces itself in highly intelligent psychopaths. Each murder proves his theoretical methodology works, which increases his confidence and psychological investment in continued killing. Ed's mental state during body disposal activities reveals the complete objectification of his victims that marks his peak psychological development. He treats human remains like waste materials to be disposed of efficiently, showing no emotional response to the physical evidence of his violence. The psychological control mechanisms that Ed employs during his peak period allow him to maintain normal social relationships while pursuing systematic murder. He can date women, maintain employment, interact with police as a helpful citizen, all while planning and executing elaborate killings. Ed's peak psychological state includes sophisticated understanding of investigative psychology that helps him avoid detection. He studies how serial killer investigations develop, which behavioral patterns attract attention, which investigative techniques pose the greatest threat to his continued activities. The psychological pressure management that Ed demonstrates during this period shows how he channels mounting internal tension into increasingly efficient violence. Instead of losing control, psychological pressure enhances his analytical capabilities and methodological precision. Ed's mental processing of media coverage about his crimes reveals the psychological satisfaction he derives from public fear and police confusion. Reading about his murders in newspapers provides additional psychological reward beyond the killing itself. The psychological adaptation that Ed shows during his peak period includes continuous refinement of his killing methodology. Each murder teaches him something new about victim psychology, police investigation patterns, or disposal techniques. The learning process never stops. Ed's peak psychological state demonstrates how exceptional intelligence can create perfect predatory efficiency. His analytical capabilities, institutional education, and practical experience combine to produce systematic killing that operates like a well-designed machine. The psychological trajectory that Ed follows during this period shows steady movement toward the ultimate target of his rage. Each college student murder serves as psychological preparation for killing his mother. The escalation has a specific destination. Ed's mental state during this peak period reflects complete psychological evolution from damaged child to perfect predator. All the elements of his development have integrated into a unified system focused entirely on the efficient acquisition and destruction of human targets. The psychological momentum that Ed builds during his peak killing period creates an internal pressure that demands resolution. The murders become psychologically insufficient. Only killing his mother can provide the ultimate satisfaction he seeks. Ed's peak psychological state includes perfect calibration of his social mask to avoid suspicion. During his most active killing period, he appears more normal and helpful than ever before, volunteering with police, offering assistance to investigators, maintaining perfect behavioral camouflage. The psychological complexity that Ed exhibits during this period exceeds most psychiatric understanding of serial killer development. His combination of exceptional intelligence, systematic methodology, and complete emotional detachment creates behavioral patterns that challenge traditional criminal psychology models. Ed's mental processing during his peak period shows how psychological pressure from successful violence creates its own escalation demands. Each murder must be more sophisticated, more psychologically satisfying, more challenging than the previous killing. The bar keeps rising. The psychological efficiency that Ed achieves during his peak period represents the ultimate expression of predatory behavior enhanced by exceptional intelligence and systematic education. He has become the perfect killing machine that his institutional years were designed to create. Ed's peak psychological state during 1972 to 1973 reveals what happens when genius-level intelligence fully aligns with predatory instincts and systematic criminal methodology. The result is a level of predatory efficiency that law enforcement has never encountered before. The psychological momentum building during this peak period points toward inevitable confrontation with the source of his rage. Ed's mother represents the ultimate target, the final test of his psychological and methodological development. Everything has been preparation for that moment. By April 1973, Ed Kemper has reached the absolute peak of his psychological and methodological development. The genius giant operates at maximum efficiency, having transformed every aspect of his damaged psychology into perfect predatory capability. The ultimate confrontation approaches. What happens when this peak psychological state finally focuses on its primary target? When all the methodology, all the practice, all the psychological pressure converge on the woman who created this monster. When the genius giant decides it's time to complete his psychological evolution. 1970 to 1973. Ed Kemper achieves something that defies psychological understanding: perfect duality. He transforms into California's most efficient serial killer while simultaneously becoming the model citizen, helpful son, and trusted community member. The control mechanisms required for this achievement represent psychological engineering at its most sophisticated. The cornerstone of Ed's control system is what psychologists call dissociative compartmentalization, but his version surpasses anything documented in clinical literature. His mind operates like a high-security facility with completely isolated sections. The killer Ed never contaminates the citizen Ed. The separation is absolute. Ed's work life at the California Highway Department becomes more than employment, it's psychological camouflage perfected through systematic analysis. He studies his coworkers' expectations, identifies the behaviors that indicate reliability and normalcy, then performs those behaviors with scientific precision. His supervisors consider him their most dependable employee. The daily routine that Ed constructs serves as psychological architecture for his double life. Morning conversation with his mother over coffee establishes normal son identity. 8 hours of highway construction work reinforces productive citizen identity. Evening activities, some involving murder, occur in completely separate psychological space. Ed's social engineering during this period rivals the most sophisticated intelligence operations. He cultivates relationships with police officers, mental health professionals, and community members who can vouch for his character. When suspicion eventually arises, he has an entire network of character witnesses. The stress transformation techniques that Ed develops turn psychological pressure into performance enhancement rather than behavioral compromise. When internal tension from his criminal activities builds, he channels it into exceptional work performance, helpful community service, and charming social interactions. Ed's manipulation of official documentation creates a paper trail that supports his normal persona while concealing his criminal activities. Medical records show continued mental health improvement. Employment records demonstrate consistent reliability. Legal documents indicate full rehabilitation from his teenage crimes. The temporal control system that Ed employs allows him to commit murders without disrupting his established behavioral patterns. He calculates optimal timing for criminal activities based on work schedules, family obligations, and social commitments. Every murder fits seamlessly into his normal routine. Ed's psychological performance management during mandatory psychiatric evaluations demonstrates control mechanisms that exceed professional understanding. He presents genuine-seeming emotional responses, insightful self-analysis, and appropriate treatment progress while concealing his true mental state completely. The relationship maintenance protocols that Ed follows with his mother require extraordinary psychological discipline. He must appear loving while planning matricide, helpful while nursing homicidal rage, concerned while calculating her murder. The emotional performance demands perfect control over every micro-expression and vocal inflection. Ed's evidence control methodology encompasses both physical and behavioral aspects. He not only eliminates forensic evidence from crime scenes, but also manages his own behavioral indicators to prevent suspicion. Clothing, vehicle maintenance, schedule disruptions, every detail receives systematic attention. The psychological energy allocation system that Ed develops prevents his demanding double life from creating performance degradation in either role. He budgets mental resources like a financial planner, ensuring adequate psychological capacity for both normal activities and criminal pursuits. Ed's crisis management protocols prepare him for unexpected situations that might threaten his cover. He develops contingency responses for various scenarios: surprise visits during criminal activities, unexpected police questioning, spontaneous social invitations during murder planning. Every possibility receives advanced preparation. The communication adaptation mechanisms that Ed employs allow him to interface perfectly with different social groups. His language patterns, emotional expressions, and intellectual presentations adjust automatically based on his audience. Police officers, family members, co-workers, and psychiatrists each see precisely what they expect. Ed's financial control systems ensure his criminal activities create no suspicious spending patterns. Murder-related expenses, weapons, cleaning supplies, gas for body disposal trips integrate seamlessly into his normal budget. No unusual purchases attract attention from family or authorities. The academic pursuit management that Ed maintains provides legitimate cover for his criminal interests. His continued study of psychology and criminology appears intellectually curious rather than professionally relevant. He can discuss serial killer methodology as theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. Ed's time synchronization techniques allow him to accomplish murder, body disposal, evidence destruction, and psychological reset within narrow windows. He calculates every aspect of his criminal timeline with engineering precision, ensuring return to normal routine without detectable disruption. The behavioral consistency protocols that Ed follows maintain perfect normalcy regardless of recent criminal activities. His demeanor, energy levels, social interactions, and emotional responses remain constant whether he committed murder hours earlier or weeks prior. No cyclical patterns emerge. Ed's information security measures prevent crossover between his legitimate and criminal activities. Work colleagues never learn about family dynamics. Family members never discover workplace relationships. Social contacts never intersect with criminal pursuits. Each sphere remains completely isolated. The psychological transition rituals that Ed develops help him shift between his different identities without contamination. Specific mental exercises, physical activities, and environmental changes facilitate clean psychological separation between citizen and killer modes. Ed's medical appointment management ensures his official health records support his rehabilitation narrative. He schedules routine evaluations strategically, prepares appropriate responses to standard questions, and maintains documentation showing continued improvement and stability. The social calendar optimization that Ed employs balances normal community engagement with criminal opportunity windows. He maintains consistent social presence while ensuring adequate time for planning and executing murders. Neither role compromises the other's requirements. Ed's emotional expression calibration allows him to display appropriate feelings during social interactions while experiencing no genuine emotions toward the people around him. The performance includes facial expressions, vocal tones, body language, and interaction patterns that perfectly mimic authentic emotional responses. The risk assessment automation that Ed develops operates continuously in the background of his consciousness. He constantly monitors environmental factors, social dynamics, and situational variables that might threaten his cover or create criminal opportunities. Ed's intellectual curiosity management allows him to discuss criminal psychology and serial killer behavior with apparent academic interest while concealing personal expertise. He can analyze criminal methodologies, victim selection patterns, and investigative techniques without revealing professional knowledge. The psychological maintenance procedures that Ed follows ensure his control mechanisms remain effective over extended periods. Regular mental exercises, stress relief activities, and performance reviews help him identify and correct any degradation in his dual identity management. Ed's future planning integration encompasses both legitimate career development and criminal enterprise expansion. He makes authentic plans for professional advancement while simultaneously developing long-term strategies for continued killing activities. The performance monitoring systems that Ed employs help him detect when his control mechanisms might be compromising. He watches for micro-expressions, vocal variations, behavioral inconsistencies, or stress symptoms that might indicate system failure. Ed's relationship cultivation with law enforcement creates the ultimate protective mechanism. Police officers who interact with him regularly develop personal fondness for the helpful giant who volunteers information and assists with investigations. They become unwitting character witnesses. By 1973, Ed's control mechanisms represent the most sophisticated double life management system in documented criminal history. He has achieved perfect psychological duality, operating simultaneously as model citizen and efficient predator without either identity contaminating the other. The genius giant has created a psychological masterpiece, a control system so sophisticated that it allows him to pursue systematic murder while maintaining complete normalcy. His exceptional intelligence has solved the fundamental problem of criminal psychology: how to kill repeatedly without detection. What happens when these perfect control mechanisms encounter the ultimate test? When the psychological pressure finally exceeds even Ed's sophisticated management systems. When the target that created his rage demands a level of violence that threatens to shatter his carefully constructed dual existence. Late 1972 to April 1973, Ed Kemper's perfect control mechanisms begin encountering forces they cannot manage. The psychological pressure that has been building for years starts exceeding even his sophisticated management systems. The genius giant approaches the breaking point that will destroy his carefully constructed double life. The escalation begins with diminishing psychological satisfaction from routine murders. The hitchhiker killings that once provided ultimate satisfaction now feel insufficient. Ed's analytical mind recognizes that he has become psychologically addicted to murder, but the addiction requires increasingly intense stimulation to achieve the same effect. Ed's relationship with his mother during this period becomes the primary pressure point threatening his control systems. Every interaction with Clarnell reactivates the fundamental rage that created his psychological dysfunction. The daily contact with his primary tormentor creates mounting tension that his compartmentalization struggles to contain. The frequency of Ed's violent fantasies increases dramatically during this period. What once occurred occasionally now dominates his mental landscape. He spends increasing amounts of time planning elaborate murder scenarios, refining killing techniques, and fantasizing about ultimate violence against his mother. Ed's risk tolerance begins shifting as psychological pressure builds. Activities he previously considered too dangerous now seem acceptable. The careful risk assessment that protected him for years starts yielding to mounting internal pressure that demands satisfaction regardless of consequences. The sleep disturbances that Ed experiences during this period indicate his control mechanisms are beginning to fail. The compartmentalization that allowed him to function normally becomes less effective as violent thoughts intrude into previously protected psychological spaces. Ed's work performance, while still acceptable, shows subtle degradation that his supervisors might eventually notice. The psychological energy required to maintain his double life begins exceeding his management system's capacity. Small performance slips become early warning signs of larger system failure. The social interactions that Ed maintains become more psychologically demanding as his internal pressure builds. The performance of normalcy requires increasing effort. leaving him emotionally exhausted after routine social activities that previously felt effortless. Ed's relationship dynamics with potential victims begin changing as his psychological state escalates. The careful victim selection and methodical approach start yielding to more impulsive hunting behavior. The systematic predator begins showing signs of desperation. The media coverage of his crimes creates an unexpected pressure point that feeds Ed's escalation. Reading about police investigations, victim families, and public fear provides psychological stimulation that increases his need for more intense violence to achieve satisfaction. Ed's living situation with his mother becomes increasingly psychologically toxic as his rage intensifies. The daily exposure to his primary tormentor while planning her murder creates cognitive dissonance that his compartmentalization cannot fully manage. The fantasy escalation that Ed experiences during this period focuses increasingly on matricide scenarios. The elaborate plans for killing his mother become more detailed, more violent, more psychologically satisfying in his imagination. The fantasy begins demanding implementation. Ed's emotional regulation during family interactions requires superhuman psychological effort as his rage intensifies. The performance of loving son while nursing homicidal fury becomes unsustainable. Micro-expressions and vocal inflections begin betraying his true psychological state. The physical symptoms that Ed develops during this period indicate severe psychological stress. Headaches, muscle tension, and digestive issues reflect the toll that maintaining perfect control under mounting pressure takes on his body. The stress becomes somatically visible. Ed's crisis management protocols begin activating more frequently as situations arise that threaten his cover. What were once rare contingency procedures become routine requirements as his escalating psychology creates more dangerous scenarios. The time management challenges that Ed faces increase as his criminal activities become more psychologically demanding. The careful scheduling that allowed him to balance normal life with murder becomes inadequate as his violent needs require more time and energy. Ed's evidence control procedures show signs of degradation as psychological pressure affects his analytical precision. The meticulous attention to detail that protected him begins slipping as mounting rage interferes with systematic thinking. The psychological isolation that Ed experiences intensifies as his escalation makes normal social connections feel increasingly hollow. The performance of human relationships becomes psychologically exhausting when his internal reality focuses entirely on violence and death. Ed's academic pursuits during this period shift from intellectual curiosity to practical application as he researches increasingly violent criminal methodologies. The theoretical interest in criminology becomes professional development for more intense murder techniques. The financial planning that Ed conducts begins accounting for more expensive and elaborate criminal equipment as his escalating needs require more sophisticated tools. The budget management becomes more complex as his violence becomes more elaborate. Ed's relationship with law enforcement becomes more psychologically challenging as his escalation makes casual interaction with police officers increasingly difficult. The friendly cooperation that once felt natural becomes a performance requiring conscious effort. The contingency planning that Ed develops for potential exposure becomes more elaborate as his escalating behavior increases detection risk. What were simple backup plans become complex escape scenarios as his activities become more dangerous. Ed's psychological preparation rituals before murders become more intense and time-consuming as his escalation demands more elaborate mental conditioning. The transition from normal citizen to killer requires increasing psychological effort. The stress release mechanisms that Ed developed to manage normal criminal pressure prove inadequate for the escalating tension. Physical exercise, intellectual pursuits, and social activities no longer provide sufficient pressure relief for his mounting psychological needs. Ed's medical management becomes more challenging as escalating stress creates physical symptoms that might attract attention. Managing his health records to avoid revealing stress-related issues becomes another pressure point requiring constant attention. The social calendar management that Ed employs becomes increasingly difficult as his escalating psychology demands more time for criminal activities, while normal life requires consistent social presence. The balancing act becomes unsustainable. Ed's emotional expression control during routine interactions becomes more psychologically demanding as his internal reality intensifies. Displaying appropriate emotions while experiencing escalating rage requires conscious effort that exhausts his psychological resources. The risk assessment calculations that Ed performs become more complex as escalating psychology affects his judgment. The careful risk-benefit analysis that protected him begins yielding to psychological pressure that demands satisfaction regardless of consequences. Ed's intellectual curiosity management becomes more difficult as his professional expertise in violence becomes harder to disguise during academic discussions of criminal behavior. The theoretical interest becomes obviously practical knowledge. The psychological transition procedures that Ed uses to shift between identities become less effective as escalating pressure makes complete compartmentalization increasingly difficult. The clean separation between citizen and killer begins blurring. Ed's future planning becomes dominated by escalation scenarios as his mounting psychological pressure demands resolution. Long-term strategies for continued killing yield to short-term planning for ultimate violence against his primary target. The performance monitoring that Ed conducts reveals increasing system stress as escalation affects every aspect of his control mechanisms. The sophisticated management system shows signs of impending failure under mounting psychological pressure. By April 1973, Ed's escalation has reached critical mass. The psychological pressure that has been building for years now exceeds his sophisticated control system's capacity. The genius giant approaches the moment when perfect duality becomes impossible to maintain. The escalation and pressure points have created an unstable psychological system that demands resolution. Ed's mounting rage, diminishing satisfaction from routine violence, and intensifying matricidal fantasies point toward inevitable explosion. What happens when these escalating psychological forces finally overwhelm even Ed's sophisticated control mechanisms? When the pressure points converge in a moment that will destroy his carefully constructed double life? When the genius giant can no longer contain the monster within? 1972 to April 1973. As young women disappear across Santa Cruz County, an unprecedented psychological battle unfolds between exceptional criminal intelligence and traditional law enforcement. Ed Kemper transforms police investigation into intellectual game where he holds every advantage. The initial police response to missing hitchhikers reflects conventional understanding of crime patterns. Investigators assume they're dealing with typical predatory behavior, impulsive, disorganized, eventually self-revealing. They have no conceptual framework for systematic predation by someone with Ed's methodological sophistication. Ed's psychological advantage stems from comprehensive criminal education gained during his institutional years. While police rely on experience with ordinary criminals, Ed studied advanced criminal psychology. investigative procedures, and behavioral analysis techniques that most law enforcement officers never encounter. The investigative psychology that emerges reveals how traditional police training fails when confronting exceptional criminal intelligence. Officers learn to identify nervous behaviors, inconsistent stories, and suspicious activities. Ed presents perfect consistency, complete calm, and helpful cooperation. Ed's cultivation of law enforcement relationships during this period represents strategic intelligence gathering disguised as community service. He volunteers information about criminal psychology, offers assistance with unrelated cases, and builds personal friendships that provide direct access to investigative thinking. The police social dynamics that Ed infiltrates create unprecedented psychological camouflage. He attends barbecues with officers investigating his crimes, discusses criminal behavior with detectives hunting him, offers insights about serial killer psychology while concealing his professional expertise in systematic murder. Ed's access to investigation details through police friendships gives him strategic intelligence that no criminal should possess. He knows which leads investigators consider promising, which evidence they find significant, which forensic techniques they plan to employ. The hunted becomes the observer of his hunters. The psychological profiling attempts by investigators consistently fail because their analytical frameworks cannot accommodate Ed's combination of exceptional intelligence and emotional detachment. They envision someone driven by sexual dysfunction or childhood trauma, not intellectual superiority and methodological perfection. Ed's manipulation of individual investigators includes systematic analysis of their psychological vulnerabilities and professional insecurities. He identifies which officers need intellectual validation, which crave recognition, which respond to helpful cooperation. Each relationship serves specific intelligence purposes. The evidence analysis conducted by investigators fails to reveal incriminating patterns because its methodological sophistication exceeds their analytical capabilities. They search for conventional forensic indicators while confronting someone who understands evidence management better than they do. Ed's psychological response to investigative pressure transforms potential stress into intellectual stimulation. Instead of anxiety about potential capture, he experiences satisfaction from watching highly trained professionals struggle with his superior methodology. The investigation becomes entertainment. The media coverage that emerges during the investigation creates additional psychological dynamics that Ed exploits strategically. Public fear validates his criminal effectiveness, while pressure on police creates investigative desperation that he can manipulate. Ed's strategic information sharing with investigators demonstrates sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. He provides enough helpful insights to maintain his reputation as valuable ally while carefully avoiding information that might direct suspicion toward him. The investigative timeline that develops reveals how Ed's methodological precision confuses traditional criminal investigation patterns. His systematic evidence destruction, careful victim selection, and perfect behavioral control create no clear analytical pathway for investigators to follow. Ed's relationship with specific detectives becomes particularly psychologically significant. His friendship with lead investigators provides comprehensive intelligence about investigative strategies while creating personal affection that compromises professional objectivity about potential suspects. The psychological pressure that mounts on investigators as their methods fail creates professional desperation that Ed recognizes and exploits. Officers facing public criticism and career consequences become more susceptible to manipulation by helpful informants offering criminal insights. Ed's participation in police training sessions during this period represents the ultimate expression of his manipulation capabilities. He lectures law enforcement officers about criminal psychology and investigative techniques while simultaneously evading their investigation of his own crimes. The investigative psychology reveals how personal relationships between suspects and investigators can completely compromise criminal detection. Officers who consider Ed a friend cannot maintain appropriate suspicion about his potential involvement in cases they're investigating. Ed's psychological preparation for potential interrogation includes systematic planning for every aspect of investigative pressure. He develops strategies for maintaining his helpful persona, explanations for any suspicious circumstances, and psychological techniques for deflecting serious suspicion. The resource allocation decisions that investigators make during this period reflect their fundamental misunderstanding of Ed's criminal sophistication. They waste time pursuing leads that his methodological precision has made irrelevant while overlooking indicators of his actual involvement. Ed's behavioral management during investigative heat includes careful monitoring of his own performance to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention. He maintains perfect normalcy while internally savoring the intellectual challenge of operating under investigative scrutiny. The psychological profiling conferences that investigators conduct produce assessments that consistently underestimate Ed's capabilities because their experience base includes no criminals with his combination of intellectual gifts and systematic methodology. Ed's intelligence gathering extends beyond individual relationships to include administrative personnel, support staff, and civilian employees who provide additional access to investigative information and institutional dynamics. The investigative psychology during this period demonstrates how exceptional criminal intelligence can systematically neutralize traditional law enforcement advantages. Ed's understanding of police procedures, evidence analysis, and investigative psychology gives him strategic superiority over his pursuers. Ed's psychological satisfaction from observing investigative confusion exceeds the pleasure he derives from individual murders. Watching professionals fail to comprehend his methodology provides ultimate validation of his intellectual superiority over conventional criminal justice systems. The strategic positioning that Ed maintains during this period includes establishing character witnesses, behavioral patterns, and institutional relationships that will protect him if suspicion eventually focuses his direction. Every contingency receives systematic advance planning. Ed's relationship cultivation includes participation in police social functions, volunteer activities, and community events that provide additional opportunities for intelligence gathering while strengthening his reputation as helpful citizen rather than criminal suspect. The psychological chess match between Ed and investigators reveals how intellectual superiority can overcome institutional advantages when the gap in analytical capabilities becomes sufficiently large. The genius operates beyond their conceptual framework. Ed's strategic behavioral adaptation during investigative pressure includes subtle modifications to his criminal methodology that account for increased police attention while maintaining his killing activities. He evolves his techniques in real time based on investigative intelligence. The investigative psychology shows how traditional police work becomes ineffective when confronting criminal behavior that exceeds conventional understanding. Ed operates in psychological territory that law enforcement training never anticipated. Ed's psychological management of investigation stress includes transforming potential pressure into enhanced criminal performance rather than behavioral degradation. The scrutiny becomes fuel for more sophisticated criminal activity rather than deterrent to continued violence. The relationship dynamics create surreal psychological situations where hunters regularly socialize with their prey while remaining completely unaware of his identity. Ed attends Christmas parties with officers investigating his murders. By April 1973, the investigation psychology has created complete stalemate where traditional law enforcement methods cannot penetrate Ed's sophisticated criminal camouflage. The genius giant operates with total impunity while maintaining friendly relationships with his pursuers. The psychological advantage that Ed maintains over investigators demonstrates how exceptional intelligence applied to criminal activity can create perfect predatory systems that conventional detection methods cannot identify or penetrate. What happens when this intellectual superiority finally encounters forces that exceed even Ed's analytical capabilities? When the psychological pressure that created his criminal methodology finally overwhelms the control systems that protected him? When the genius giant's perfect criminal intelligence meets its ultimate limitation? April 2021, 1973. The psychological pressure that has been building for years finally overwhelms Ed Kemper's sophisticated control mechanisms. In a span of 24 hours, the genius giant commits the ultimate murders and then experiences complete psychological breakdown. The perfect criminal destroys himself. The night of April 20, 1973 represents the culmination of Ed's entire psychological development. Every element converges, escalating pressure, diminishing satisfaction from routine murders, and the overwhelming need to confront the source of his rage. His mother becomes the inevitable target. Ed's psychological state as he enters his mother's bedroom shows complete system failure of his compartmentalization mechanisms. The careful separation between his various identities collapses as all his psychological energy focuses on the ultimate act of violence that will either satisfy his needs or destroy him completely. The murder of Edmund Kemper represents more than matricide, it's the psychological resolution Ed has been building toward his entire life. Every previous killing was practice for this moment. Every manipulation technique, every methodological refinement, every control mechanism was preparation for destroying the woman who created his rage. Ed's psychological experience during his mother's murder reveals the complete breakdown of his emotional detachment. For the first time since childhood, he experiences genuine emotion during violence. The analytical precision that characterized his previous murders gives way to raw, uncontrolled fury. The decapitation and sexual assault of his mother's corpse show Ed's psychological state moving beyond systematic criminal behavior into complete psychological disintegration. The intellectual predator becomes a frenzied animal acting on pure psychological compulsion rather than calculated methodology. Ed's decision to invite Sally Hallett over after killing his mother demonstrates his psychological awareness that his control systems have failed completely. He cannot return to normal behavior after the ultimate violence. The perfect criminal knows his methodology has reached its endpoint. The murder of Sally Hallett represents Ed's psychological recognition that his double life is permanently destroyed. He kills her not for satisfaction, but as a final expression of his criminal methodology before inevitable exposure. The genius giant completes his psychological evolution. Ed's behavior immediately after the murders shows complete psychological exhaustion. The superhuman effort required to maintain his double life for years finally overwhelms his systems. He experiences what psychologists call criminal burnout, complete depletion of psychological resources needed for continued deception. The 24-hour period following the murders reveals Ed's psychological transformation from perfect criminal to confused, exhausted individual unable to maintain his sophisticated facade. The control mechanisms that protected him for years simply stop functioning. Ed's decision to flee Colorado represents his last attempt to activate emergency psychological protocols, but the distance cannot restore his shattered compartmentalization or regenerate his depleted deception capabilities. The breakdown is complete and irreversible. The psychological state that Ed experiences during his flight shows complete cognitive dissonance. The analytical mind that planned every detail of his criminal career cannot process the reality that his perfect methodology has led to inevitable exposure and capture. Ed's phone call to police from Colorado demonstrates his psychological recognition that continued flight is psychologically impossible. His confession represents not remorse, but analytical acknowledgement that his criminal enterprise has reached its logical conclusion. The psychological motivation behind Ed's confession reveals his need to regain intellectual control over his situation. By voluntarily surrendering and providing detailed information about his crimes, he attempts to restore his sense of analytical superiority even in defeat. Ed's detailed description of his criminal methodology during confession shows his psychological inability to completely abandon his identity as the genius killer. Even in surrender, he demonstrates his intellectual sophistication and methodological precision to investigators. The psychological breakdown that Ed experiences during interrogation includes complete abandonment of the social mask that protected him for years. The charming, helpful persona dissolves, revealing the cold, analytical intelligence that plans systematic murder. Ed's cooperation with investigators during confession demonstrates his psychological need to be recognized as the most sophisticated criminal they have ever encountered. His ego requires acknowledgement of his intellectual superiority even as his criminal career ends. The psychological relief that Ed experiences after confession shows how exhausting his double life had become. The superhuman effort required to maintain perfect duality for years created psychological pressure that his breakdown finally releases. Ed's behavior during psychological evaluation after arrest reveals someone whose identity has completely integrated around his criminal activities. Without the need to maintain his normal persona, he becomes fully the analytical killer that was always his true psychological core. The psychological analysis of Ed's surrender shows how exceptional criminal intelligence can become self-defeating. His analytical capabilities that enabled perfect crimes also force him to recognize when continued criminal activity becomes logically impossible. Ed's interaction with mental health professionals after arrest demonstrates his psychological evolution from patient to colleague. His institutional education and criminal experience give him expertise that equals or exceeds his evaluator's knowledge. The psychological pressure that led to Ed's breakdown includes not just external factors, but internal recognition that his criminal methodology had achieved its ultimate expression. Having killed his mother, no future violence could provide equivalent psychological satisfaction. Ed's confession psychology reveals someone whose intellectual honesty compels complete disclosure of his criminal methodology. His analytical mind cannot tolerate partial truth or incomplete information about his sophisticated criminal enterprise. The psychological transformation that Ed undergoes during arrest processing shows complete abandonment of his citizen identity. The helpful community member disappears, leaving only the analytical killer who views his criminal career as his greatest intellectual achievement. Ed's psychological response to media attention after arrest demonstrates his continued need for recognition of his criminal sophistication. The genius giant wants public acknowledgement of his methodological superiority over other killers and investigators. The psychological analysis of Ed's breakdown reveals how even the most sophisticated criminal control mechanisms cannot withstand infinite pressure. His perfect methodology eventually encountered psychological forces that exceeded its management capacity. Ed's behavior during legal proceedings shows someone psychologically comfortable with his criminal identity. Without the need to maintain deception, he can finally express his true analytical nature and criminal expertise openly. The psychological significance of Ed's breakdown extends beyond individual criminal psychology to reveal the limitations of exceptional intelligence applied to violent crime. Even genius-level analytical capabilities cannot create sustainable criminal enterprises. Ed's psychological state during incarceration shows someone whose identity has stabilized around his criminal achievements. The internal conflict between citizen and killer identities resolves completely in favor of his analytical predator persona. The psychological aftermath of Ed's breakdown includes his evolution into a criminal psychology expert who helps professionals understand serial killer behavior. His analytical intelligence finds new expression in academic rather than criminal pursuits. Ed's psychological reflection on his breakdown reveals his analytical understanding of why his perfect methodology ultimately failed. The genius giant can analyze his own psychological collapse with the same precision he once applied to victim selection. By April 1973, Ed Kemper's psychological breakdown represents the inevitable conclusion of exceptional criminal intelligence applied to systematic violence. The perfect predator destroys himself through the very analytical capabilities that made him so dangerous. The capture and breakdown reveal how even the most sophisticated criminal psychology contains inherent contradictions that eventually lead to self-destruction. The genius giant's perfect methodology could not survive the psychological pressure it created. What happens when this breakdown individual faces the legal system designed to process ordinary criminals? When exceptional criminal intelligence encounters traditional justice procedures? When the genius giant must navigate institutional systems as defendant rather than manipulator? April 1973 to November 1973. Ed Kemper enters the legal system as a confessed serial killer whose intellectual capabilities far exceed anything the courts have encountered. The genius giant transforms his trial into a psychological demonstration of criminal sophistication that challenges every assumption about justice, mental illness, and criminal responsibility. Ed's initial court appearances reveal someone psychologically comfortable with his new role as acknowledged criminal mastermind. Without the need to maintain his citizen facade, he can finally express his true analytical nature and criminal expertise openly. The performance shifts from deception to demonstration. The psychological evaluation process that the court orders becomes an intellectual chess match between Ed and mental health professionals. His institutional education and criminal experience give him expertise that equals or exceeds his evaluator's knowledge. He becomes colleague rather than patient. Ed's interaction with his defense attorneys demonstrates his psychological need to maintain intellectual control even in legal defeat. He provides strategic guidance, offers psychological insights about his crimes, and essentially manages his own defense while his lawyers serve as administrative assistants. The competency hearings that determine Ed's fitness for trial reveal the legal system's inability to process someone with his psychological profile. The standard assessments cannot accommodate exceptional intelligence combined with complete acknowledgement of criminal behavior and rational understanding of consequences. Ed's psychological state during arraignment shows someone who views the legal proceedings as intellectual validation rather than punishment. The formal charges become official recognition of his criminal sophistication and methodological achievements. The courtroom becomes his academic forum. The plea negotiations that occur demonstrate Ed's strategic understanding of legal psychology. He recognizes that his confession and cooperation provide leverage for avoiding death penalty, while his intellectual capabilities make him valuable for criminal psychology research. Ed's psychological preparation for trial includes systematic analysis of jury selection, courtroom dynamics, and legal procedures. He approaches his own trial with the same analytical precision he once applied to victim selection and murder methodology. The media management that Ed employs during legal proceedings reveals his continued need for public recognition of his criminal intellectual achievements. He grants interviews, provides insights about his methodology, and positions himself as the most sophisticated killer in criminal history. Ed's interaction with court psychiatrists becomes particularly psychologically significant. His ability to analyze his own mental state with clinical precision while maintaining complete emotional detachment creates unprecedented challenges for forensic psychology assessment. The legal strategy that emerges reflects the system's struggle to process someone who admits complete guilt while demonstrating perfect rational understanding of his crimes. Traditional concepts of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and legal competency become inadequate frameworks. Ed's psychological response to victim impact statements shows his complete emotional detachment from the human consequences of his crimes. He can listen to grieving families describe their loss while analyzing their emotional responses as psychological data rather than experiencing empathy. The competency evaluation process reveals how Ed's institutional education allows him to navigate psychiatric assessment more effectively than the professionals conducting it. He understands the tests, knows the expected responses, and can demonstrate rational understanding of legal concepts. Ed's courtroom behavior demonstrates his psychological evolution into someone whose identity has completely integrated around his criminal achievements. The helpful citizen persona disappears permanently, replaced by the analytical killer who views his crimes as intellectual accomplishments. The legal team's psychological challenge includes representing someone whose criminal sophistication exceeds their understanding of violent behavior. Ed's methodological precision and psychological complexity create defense strategies that conventional legal training never anticipated. Ed's participation in legal proceedings includes systematic observation of courtroom psychology, judicial decision-making patterns, and jury behavioral dynamics. Even facing life imprisonment, he continues gathering psychological data for analytical purposes. The psychiatric testimony about Ed's mental state creates unprecedented legal psychology challenges. How does the system process someone who demonstrates complete rational understanding of his crimes while showing no emotional capacity for empathy or remorse? Ed's psychological interaction with the judge reveals someone who understands legal authority structures while maintaining intellectual superiority over institutional representatives. He shows appropriate respect for judicial process while demonstrating analytical capabilities that exceed court personnel. The sentencing phase psychology includes Ed's strategic decision to accept life imprisonment rather than pursue appeals or insanity defenses. His analytical mind recognizes that continued legal proceedings cannot change the fundamental reality of his criminal career. Ed's psychological adaptation to conviction shows someone whose intellectual identity remains intact despite legal defeat. The genius giant accepts imprisonment as the logical consequence of his criminal methodology rather than experiencing it as punishment. The psychological impact of Ed's case on legal professionals reveals how exceptional criminal intelligence challenges traditional concepts of justice and criminal responsibility. Attorneys, judges, and mental health professionals struggle with unprecedented psychological complexity. Ed's interaction with correctional psychology during initial incarceration demonstrates his continued analytical approach to institutional systems. He studies prison dynamics, staff psychology, and administrative procedures with the same precision he once applied to criminal activities. The legal precedent implications of Ed's case include questions about how justice systems should process criminals whose intellectual capabilities exceed institutional understanding. His psychological profile creates new categories that existing legal frameworks cannot accommodate. Ed's psychological reflection on legal proceedings reveals his analytical satisfaction with how the system processed his case. The genius giant appreciates the intellectual challenge of navigating legal psychology while maintaining his identity as sophisticated criminal mastermind. The appellate process psychology includes Ed's strategic decision to avoid pursuing legal remedies that might reduce his sentence. His analytical understanding of legal psychology suggests that accepting responsibility provides more intellectual satisfaction than attempting escape through technicalities. Ed's psychological relationship with legal authority includes recognition that the justice system represents intellectual validation of his criminal achievements. The formal legal processing confirms his status as exceptional criminal rather than ordinary violent offender. The correctional psychology assessment that occurs during initial imprisonment reveals someone whose criminal identity has stabilized around intellectual achievement rather than violent compulsion. Ed views his crimes as academic accomplishments rather than psychological pathology. Ed's interaction with appellate attorneys demonstrates his continued need to maintain intellectual control over legal proceedings that affect him. He provides strategic guidance, analytical insights, and essentially manages his own appeals process. The psychological significance of Ed's legal proceedings extends beyond individual criminal justice to reveal institutional limitations when processing exceptional criminal intelligence. The system adapts to accommodate unprecedented psychological complexity. Ed's psychological evolution during legal proceedings includes transformation from defendant to criminal psychology expert who helps legal professionals understand serial killer behavior. His analytical intelligence finds new expression within institutional constraints. The legal system. Psychology that emerges from Ed's case includes recognition that traditional concepts of criminal responsibility, mental illness, and judicial processing require expansion to accommodate exceptional criminal intelligence combined with complete rational understanding. Ed's psychological acceptance of life imprisonment reflects his analytical recognition that his criminal career achieved its maximum possible expression. The legal consequences represent logical conclusion rather than unjust punishment for his methodological achievements. By November 1973, Ed's interaction with the legal system demonstrates how exceptional criminal intelligence can transform judicial proceedings into psychological education for legal professionals. The genius giant becomes teacher rather than simply defendant. The legal system psychology reveals institutional adaptation when confronting criminal behavior that exceeds conventional understanding. Ed's case creates new frameworks for processing exceptional criminal intelligence within traditional justice structures. What happens when this legally processed genius begins his permanent institutional life? When exceptional criminal intelligence adapts to prison psychology? When the genius giant transforms from active predator to institutional expert on violent behavior? 1973 to present. Ed Kemper's case transforms criminal psychology, law enforcement training, and mental health treatment in ways that continue reverberating 50 years later. The genius giant's legacy extends far beyond his crimes to reshape how society understands and prevents exceptional criminal intelligence. The immediate psychological impact of Ed's case on criminal justice professionals reveals how one exceptional criminal can force institutional evolution. FBI profilers, police investigators, and mental health professionals recognize that their training and analytical frameworks are inadequate for processing criminals with Ed's intellectual sophistication. Ed's cooperation with criminal psychology research during imprisonment creates unprecedented opportunities for academic study of exceptional criminal intelligence. His analytical insights about his own psychological development, criminal methodology, and institutional manipulation provide data that no previous case study could offer. The law enforcement training modifications that emerge from Ed's case include new protocols for identifying and investigating criminals whose intellectual capabilities exceed traditional detection methods. Police academies begin teaching courses on exceptional criminal intelligence and sophisticated manipulation techniques. Ed's psychological profile becomes the foundation for understanding how institutional treatment can inadvertently create more sophisticated criminals. Mental health professionals recognize that their therapeutic techniques, when applied to individuals with antisocial personality disorders and exceptional intelligence, can enhance rather than reduce criminal capabilities. The psychiatric evaluation procedures that develop from Ed's case include new assessment tools designed to identify individuals whose intellectual gifts mask severe personality disorders. The genius giant's ability to manipulate psychological testing leads to more sophisticated evaluation techniques. Ed's ongoing psychological analysis during imprisonment reveals how exceptional criminal intelligence adapts to institutional constraints. His evolution from active predator to criminal psychology consultant demonstrates the persistence of analytical capabilities even within maximum security environments. The victim-family psychology that emerges from Ed's case includes new understanding of how exceptional criminal sophistication affects grief and recovery processes. Families struggle with the reality that their loved ones were killed by someone whose intellectual capabilities they respected and whose public persona they found charming. Ed's psychological legacy in criminal profiling includes recognition that traditional behavioral analysis techniques fail when confronting criminals whose intelligence allows them to manipulate investigative expectations. FBI profilers develop new methodologies specifically designed for exceptional criminal intelligence. The institutional psychology modifications that result from Ed's case include new protocols for treating violent offenders with high intellectual capabilities. Psychiatric facilities recognize that their therapeutic communities can become criminal universities when they include individuals with Ed's analytical gifts and antisocial characteristics. Ed's psychological insights about his own development provide unprecedented data for preventing similar criminal evolution. His ability to analyze his psychological formation with clinical precision offers mental health professionals new understanding of how exceptional intelligence can enhance, rather than inhibit violent behavior. The educational psychology implications of Ed's case include new awareness of how intellectual gifts, when combined with severe emotional dysfunction, can create dangerous rather than beneficial outcomes. Educational systems begin developing protocols for identifying and supporting intellectually gifted children who show antisocial tendencies. Ed's psychological contribution to understanding maternal abuse effects reveals how psychological torture by primary caregivers can have more devastating long-term consequences than physical abuse. His case becomes foundational for studying emotional maltreatment of intellectually gifted children. The therapeutic psychology lessons from Ed's case include recognition that traditional treatment modalities can be completely ineffective or even counterproductive when applied to individuals with exceptional intelligence and personality disorders. Mental health professionals develop new approaches specifically designed for this population. Ed's psychological analysis of his institutional manipulation techniques provides unprecedented insight into how sophisticated criminals can exploit therapeutic environments. His detailed explanations help mental health professionals recognize and prevent similar manipulation in future cases. The prevention psychology that emerges from Ed's case focuses on early identification of intellectual gifts combined with severe emotional dysfunction. Child psychologists develop new assessment tools for recognizing potentially dangerous combinations of exceptional intelligence and antisocial development patterns. Ed's psychological legacy in understanding compartmentalization includes new appreciation for how exceptional intelligence can create perfect psychological separation between different aspects of identity. His case becomes foundational for studying dissociative capabilities in criminal populations. The family psychology implications of Ed's case include new understanding of how maternal psychological abuse can create specific patterns of rage and violence in intellectually gifted children. Mental health professionals develop new therapeutic approaches for addressing childhood emotional trauma in high-intelligence populations. Ed's psychological insights about victim selection methodology provide unprecedented data for protecting potential targets of sophisticated predators. His detailed explanations of psychological vulnerability assessment help develop prevention strategies that account for criminal intellectual sophistication. The institutional psychology modifications that result from Ed's cooperation include new protocols for managing violent offenders whose intellectual capabilities exceed staff training. Correctional systems develop specialized programs for individuals whose criminal sophistication requires enhanced security and therapeutic approaches. Ed's psychological contribution to understanding serial killer development reveals how exceptional intelligence can accelerate and enhance violent behavioral patterns. His case becomes foundational for studying how intellectual gifts can serve criminal rather than prosocial purposes. The investigative psychology advances that emerge from Ed's case include new techniques for detecting criminals whose intelligence allows them to manipulate traditional law enforcement methods. Police training incorporates lessons from Ed's successful evasion of investigation for years. Ed's psychological analysis of his double life maintenance provides unprecedented insight into how sophisticated criminals can function normally in society while pursuing systematic violence. His detailed explanations help develop detection methods for identifying similar behavioral patterns. The mental health training modifications that result from Ed's case include new curricula for recognizing and treating individuals whose intellectual gifts mask severe personality disorders. Graduate programs in psychology incorporate Ed's case as foundational study material. Ed's psychological legacy in understanding criminal cooperation includes new appreciation for how exceptional criminals can provide valuable research data while maintaining their fundamental antisocial characteristics. His case demonstrates that cooperation does not indicate rehabilitation or reduce dangerousness. The prevention psychology that emerges from studying Ed's development focuses on intervention strategies for intellectually gifted children who show early signs of antisocial behavior. Mental health professionals develop new therapeutic approaches specifically designed for this high-risk population. Ed's psychological insights about institutional vulnerability provide unprecedented data for securing therapeutic environments against manipulation by sophisticated criminals. His detailed explanations of how he exploited psychiatric treatment help prevent similar abuse of mental health systems. The criminal psychology advances that result from Ed's ongoing cooperation include new understanding of how exceptional intelligence can create criminal behavior patterns that exceed traditional analytical frameworks. His case continues generating research data 50 years after his crimes. Ed's psychological contribution to understanding predatory behavior includes detailed analysis of how sophisticated criminals select, acquire, and process victims. His insights help develop protection strategies that account for criminal intellectual sophistication rather than assuming impulsive, disorganized behavior. The therapeutic psychology implications of Ed's case include recognition that some combinations of intellectual gifts and personality disorders may be fundamentally untreatable using conventional methods. Mental health professionals develop new approaches for managing, rather than curing, exceptional criminal intelligence. Ed's psychological legacy extends beyond criminal justice to influence child psychology, educational policy, and family therapy approaches. His case demonstrates how intellectual gifts, when combined with severe emotional dysfunction, can create societal threats that require comprehensive prevention strategies. By 2024, Ed Kemper's psychological legacy has fundamentally transformed how society understands, investigates, and prevents exceptional criminal intelligence. The Genius Giants case continues providing insights that help protect potential victims and identify dangerous individuals before they can implement their sophisticated criminal methodologies. The prevention psychology that has emerged from 50 years of studying Ed's case offers hope that future cases of exceptional criminal intelligence can be identified and interrupted before they reach his level of sophistication and lethality. The psychological legacy of Edmund Kemper reminds us that intelligence without empathy, brilliance without emotional connection, and analytical gifts without moral development can create monsters whose capabilities exceed our worst nightmares. Understanding this psychology is essential for preventing its repetition.